Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I'm really pleased to be here today. Looking at the delegates, it's really interesting to see such a range of disciplines and so many different people coming from all over the place to be here today. I have stepped away a bit from working in this field directly, so I felt a little bit of a fraud, really, when Duncan asked me if I would speak today. But actually, on reflecting on standing back, I actually think standing back from being really immersed in child neglect for a while has been quite helpful. It's given me a chance to stand back and look back at a range of research and writing and activities that have been going on in relation to this field. So I didn't feel quite so bad once I actually thought about it a bit further. What I was going to talk today about is tackling neglect, and my contention is that we actually have everything we need to address neglect. We've got plenty of evidence, we've got plenty of information, we know what we need to do, we just need to do it. So my question is why we don't, and that's what I want to kind of reflect upon a little bit today. Okay, so I wanted to put a few acknowledgements because this is relevant, because you'll see the number of people that have been involved in our thinking about neglect over the years. And in particular, there's a group of people up there, some of who are in this room today, where we did a lot of thinking around an idea for developing a neglect observatory, and also for a big bid to the ESRC, which was unsuccessful. So we're not bitter, are we? We're not bitter. But there's actually still a lot of material in there which we are still drawing on, and which I think is worth revisiting. And it's also to give heart to people who are bidding for things that quite often you fail, but it's still worth doing the work for it because the thinking is really useful. And one of the organisations that have contributed considerably to developments in the field of neglect have been Action for Children, who funded a lot of the work that we have done and others in relation to neglect. And there's also, I revisited the materials that initially the Department for Education helped to fund, and then it was adapted by some funding from the Scottish Government around developing a set of training materials around child neglect. Now, if you haven't seen them, it's worth actually delving into them because there's a huge amount of things in there. There's all sorts of presentations that you can use in training and development. There's theoretical background. There's some audio visuals you can use in training, so little video snips, and it's very built around a number of case studies that we developed. So it kind of got a bit buried out there with all the plethora of stuff that exists, which is partly my point, really, today. But there is a lot in there that you might find of interest. When I was asked to speak, I was given a suggested title, which was The Case for Optimism in Child Protection, What's Changed for Children. And I actually rejected that title because having moved away from my work in neglect, I was starting to feel a little bit despondent about what I thought was going on in relation to services for children and responses to children. I was feeling more and more as if we had all that we needed, we had the evidence, but the overwhelming impact of austerity, the overwhelming impact of cuts upon services, the shifts in political ideology were making it impossible to put any of it actually into practice. So I was really beginning to lose some of my optimism, which was interesting because I think I have been known as the Pollyanna of social work academia for many, many years. And indeed, when I left Stirling University, one of my colleagues gave me a copy of Pollyanna as my going away present. So this was a little bit disconcerting. But then I was reflecting upon, what does it mean to be optimistic? And one of my colleagues recently described themselves as a naive optimist. And when I looked it up, it was someone who makes emphatically positive estimates without sufficient evidence. And it's also seen to be intellectual immaturity. Now, in all my research around resilience, optimism was one of the things that was seen to be really associated with resilience. So perhaps resilience is associated with intellectual immaturity. Sometimes it's quite helpful, just to believe something can happen, even in the face of all evidence to the contrary. But I began to re-engage with some of the optimism from a study that a colleague of mine in Scotland, Jane Scott, and I we were asked to do some work to review the 50th anniversary since the introduction of the Social Work Scotland Act. Now this is relevant to the rest of the UK because that was introduced at a time where there was a lot of developments across the whole of the UK in relation to a real sense of hope that could be brought from the social sciences. So there was a sense of a lot of research going on in social sciences that was seen to be bringing new opportunities and understandings of the structural factors that are impacting on families and upon children. And as part of this review, we interviewed a number of people who remembered actually when the Social Work Scotland Act was starting up, but also were still working in social work. And what was interesting was, despite everything that is going on, despite the huge sort of ideological impacts of austerity and inequalities, there was still a strong strand of optimism amongst social workers. Again, perhaps naive optimism. I think it would have to be naive optimism to sort of remain resilient and robust in the face of what people were facing. But what the people we were interviewing were saying is that it was important to really re-engage the optimism that lay behind the Social Work Scotland Act and acts, similar kind of acts that were being introduced across the UK at that time, which had a sense of there's understandings that we can bring from the social sciences about understanding the structural issues that will be really useful to help us address the problems that we're encountering for families. And what was also really encouraging was that we also looked at some research that was undertaken with newly qualified social workers who were surveyed within their first year. Now, the narrative amongst particularly social work academics was these new young social workers don't really understand about values, they're very individualistic, they're kind and nice and empathic, but they don't really understand the structural issues. They're impelled by a more individualistic approach. Now, this review, this research, that was undertaken with newly qualified social workers was quite contrary to that. It showed that the newly qualified social workers had come into social work because of senses of being impelled by a notion of wanting to empower people, by a sense of social justice, and also they had, even after they started practice, they were still feeling that they could live that value, the professional value of wanting to promote equal opportunities and social justice. So I find that quite encouraging. My optimism has also been recently re-engaged by, we have at Queen Margaret University, we've recently had the privilege of being able to start from scratch a degree programme in primary education. So this is to educate people who want to become primary school teachers. And we deliberately developed and marketed that programme with a strong social justice strand and with a strong underpinning in social sciences. So we didn't talk so much about the instrumental aspects of learning to teach. We talked about understanding the child in context and understanding barriers to learning. Well, we had masses of applications from young people, school leavers, and who have now started with us, and when I have met with them, all of them were hugely impelled and attracted by the social justice narrative and by the narrative of the benefit of understanding the social sciences and understanding the child in context. So that gives me hope that there is an understanding amongst the young people who we sometimes characterise as being very individualistic, narcissistic, but I think there is a wave of a sort of engagement with the bigger picture, which we are seeing coming out in some of the climate issues as well. I think an understanding of interconnectedness that is resurging through. So that gives me some hope actually for the younger people that are coming through into our education systems, and also the work I've been doing with health visitors who are studying health visiting. Again, also that strong sense of wanting to understand the contextual factors that are affecting families they're working with. So there you are. I only had a slight dip in my Pollyanna-ness, and it all came back again. And thinking about whether we're, whether there is a lack of evidence or whether I'm being naively optimistic, actually I was reflecting back on what we know about neglect, and I was remembering back to 1997 to, actually I think it was one of the first It was probably the first conference, ISPCAN. It was an ISPCAN-related conference that I spoke at, and Julie Taylor and I were both at that. And I talked about, my topic was neglect of neglect with a question mark. So I was problematizing the concept of neglect. Problematizing wasn't a word I knew, and I think that's probably a newfangled concept, problematizing things. But at the time, I was just saying, is it really neglected, or is it just too, it's too pat a statement and it sounds good? But actually, what is the evidence base? And back then, in 1997, I was arguing that we had a considerable amount of evidence to help us understand the etiology of neglect and also to understand what needs to be done to respond to it. So there you go. I didn't fix anything then. I still feel as if I haven't yet. So, but it was interesting. Then in 2012, John Devaney asked me to do the founders lecture in the BASPCAN conference in Belfast, where again I was saying, why have we made neglect so complicated? And it was really about taking a fresh look at recognising and helping the neglected child. And I wanted to review some of the key points that came from that, because I think they're still pertinent and still relevant today. So one of my key points from that was that we are overly preoccupied with definitions of neglect, and in particular trying to obtain what we almost really call a diagnosis. We need to put a label of neglect before we can actually mobilise systems. When in reality, what people are encountering is a whole spectrum of unmet need, and it's far better to focus just on that unmet need and say, what do I need to do to try and address that unmet need, and not to get tangled up in issues of diagnosis or in issues of terminology and issues of definition. So my argument was that definitions have become a padlock. They had stopped people getting services rather than unlocking opportunities for services. My other key point was that children get churned around in our systems and get sort of stuck in the net. Now, this was quite a long time ago, this talk, actually, wasn't it? 2012. So I was thinking, have things moved on? Well, there was a very recent Social Market Foundation study. Some of you will have heard this. It got quite a lot of coverage in the press, as well as in the academic literature, about the large numbers of children that are being looked after in local authorities whose services are deemed to be falling short. The increase in numbers of children in councils and services are inadequate or requiring improvement. Just looking at the corrosive impact of the level of cuts in terms of what is available to provide the support for children at an early stage, and just the extent to which we're failing children. And the quote from that study that really resonated with me is, these are the children who need the most support and the best care, yet we are collectively content to give them inadequate support and care. This neglect is nothing less than shameful. Now, a number of years ago, many of us were arguing that actually it was more important to look at state neglect, or as important, to look at state neglect of children as to look at parental neglect, that we couldn't isolate parental neglect from state neglect. And I think this, again, reiterates that same message. The unhelpful bit of this kind of research and this kind of message, though, particularly these kind of figures, is it just piles more and more pressure on the frontline people who are in these contexts, trying to deliver services and always being told that they're failing at them as well. So that sense of not only is the system failing children, but it's very demoralising from those who are trying to deliver as whatever they can with the limited resources that we have. And as we've known for years, and has been more recently evidenced by a study that I was involved in that was funded by the Nuffield Foundation on inequalities in child welfare intervention rates, yet again it is confirmed that being subject to care and or protection proceedings is associated with poverty. And the study was very, very starkly, very clearly showed that the rates of intervention were highly associated with living in areas of poverty. And each step increase in deprivation was accompanied by an increase in a child's chance of being looked after or placed in a child protection, or being subject to a child protection plan. Again, that might be the research that might be construed as research of the bleeding obvious. Yeah? So this is what people know, isn't it? That this is absolutely what the practitioners are facing every day. And then recently there's been a very popular text that's kind of grabbed the headlines. Again, I woke up one morning to the Today programme interviewing Hilary Cottam about her book on radical help, how we can remake the relationships between us and revolutionise the welfare state. Have any of you had a look at this book or heard it? On referring individuals from service to service, on recording every interaction to ensure that no one is responsible for those who inevitably fall through the gaps. These services were seeing the same individuals over and over again, people who seemed tangled and trapped in safety nets that were meant to support them. Resonates very much, doesn't it, with what I was saying many years ago. I just didn't write a popular book about it, darn it. Need to write one of these airport blockbusters. And again, she states in her book, our welfare state is not fit for purpose. It cannot support us in an emergency. It cannot enable us to live good lives, and it is a loss when confronted with a range of modern challenges, from loneliness to entrenched poverty, from a changing world of work to epidemics of obesity and depression. Oh, blimey, well, there's a bit of a pessimistic take on to dent your optimism. But again, this is not a new statement. This echoes many previous accounts. Some of you, not all of you, I see there's some younger folk in the audience, but some of you may remember the refocusing debate, remember, where the message was we need to move from a focus on risk, we need to go upstream and refocus our services on support and addressing need. It was brought out to great trumpeting of this is a new approach to child protection, and it just coincided with a huge amount of cuts and ideological political change and got kind of swallowed up and rather lost. But it was a very clear message based on the evidence that it was much better to go upstream. Most of you, I guess, will remember the Monroe Review, which challenged the stranglehold of bureaucracy of our systems and said we need to cut through this bureaucracy, we need to focus on the direct relationship with the child and actually delivering services. Many of you will have known of the late Bob Holman's wonderful community action work in Glasgow, where he went and lived in the community and said you just need to be with people and support people and address their concrete needs for support and just be alongside people in need. He just basically lived his philosophy. Some of you will know of Norma Baldwin's work on community-based approaches to child protection, where she argues that she did some really interesting analysis of the number of adults that were available to children in communities. So it was rather focusing on issues of how many lone parents are there and is that associated with harm to children. It was just looking at communities and counting up the number of adults there are in a community and the number of children there are. And the more adults there are available to support children, the better it is for children. And it was a very interesting piece of work. So it was looking at community-based approaches and geographical analysis, a different kind of take. So moving away from a focus on individual families. Many of you will know the Marmot Review and the concept of proportionate universalism, which is basically providing the kind of support that everyone needs with a little bit more for those who need a bit more. Again, not particularly rocket science, been said many times. Many of you will know Kate Morris and Breach Featherston's work on the impact of shame on parenting and the importance of looking at the needs of parents and not just focusing on the needs of children. And interestingly, when I look at everything I've written about neglect and everything that's written about neglect, you just look back at the work, for example, of the late Olive Stevenson. You look at the work of previously Jim Gordon, a researcher in Georgia, America, who wrote a wonderful monograph about how to deal with, how to tackle neglect, very much focused on community-based approaches. Everything we're writing now, or subsequently written, when you go back and look at their work, it was already said in one form or another. So, and what else? What others can you suggest? Any others? Where this has all been said before? I said there'd be some audience participate. Yeah?
It's something sort of similar, but the Anthem Health background, so the Family Nurse Partnership
Yes.
is very much about that individualised working with a young parent, young infant, for a number of years giving that individualised support.
Family Nurse Partnership,
Nowadays, programs introducing family group conferences,
Yeah.
building on community support.
Yeah. Some of you may also remember the research of Bebbington and Miles that was looking at the association between coming into care and poverty and race back when work. So yes, there have been lots of these kind of things that get said again and again and again. So interestingly, looking at, again, similarly, the effects of poverty, long recognised, again, as part of that research that Jane and I did, we went back and we looked at a report of a committee that had fed into the introduction to the Social Work Scotland Act. To my shame, I had never read this before. Actually, doing that work for the social work review made me read a lot of things that I should have read about 40 years ago. But anyway, this was a really interesting statement that came through on this committee. 1963, it stated that financial difficulties can cause stress in a family and consequent neglect of children. Now, what's interesting to me is it says cause stress. It's not all meaning as, there's a bit of an association, not everybody who's poor neglects their children. Oh no, we've got to be really careful about dealing. It's just basically saying, no, if you're poor, it really causes stress. Let's not beat about the bush. 1963. And that fed into the Social Work Scotland Act that very much recognised the importance of providing monetary support for those who are in need. And many of us who worked in social work in Scotland under that spent a lot of our time giving money to poor families to help them out of difficult situations. Again, similarly, 1984, child maltreatment as a social problem, the neglect of neglect. I had thought they had coined this term, but actually just prior to this, BASPCAN, in the spirit of our celebratory session today, 40 years of BASPCAN, a study conference in 1981 on the neglect of neglect was attended by 350 people, and a residential conference by the same name attended by 150 people. So I'm sorry, BASPCAN, but you didn't fix it in 1981, because here we are still talking about it again. But my most fundamental point was that we do have a considerable amount of evidence about the etiology of neglect, the kind of help parents and children want, and the kind of help that is likely to lead to improved outcomes for children. What we just need to do is put it into practice. And flowing from this We're Not Bitter failed bid, a number of us pulled together a special edition of Research Policy and Practice in which we wrote papers about each of the 4 nations of the UK and all the initiatives that were going on in relation to addressing neglect for children. And I think this was quite an optimistic issue of the journal. Because when you looked at it, there was a huge amount that was going on in each nation with a view to try and tackle issues of child neglect. And in particular, there's quite a lot of emphasis on going upstream. And a number of organisations, NSPCC, Action for Children, were all focusing very heavily on neglect. And it was seen as an issue that we really needed to try and tackle. And then it sort of went quite quiet, and we were deflected. I'm not saying these aren't important, but other things all started popping up and sucking some of the resources and energy that had been really focused on neglect. Now, we shouldn't be setting one thing against another, should we? But non-recent abuse, gangs, emotional and mental health, adverse child experiences, ACEs. I have to say, I'm getting really fed up of hearing the term ACE wherever you move, just at the moment. So, just, buzzwords, wonderful. If you could just invent a good acronym, your concept will go into the domain and it will get funding. So ACEs, there you are. Trauma-informed practice, county lines, online exploitation. These are not unimportant issues. But when you look at them, how many are underlined or underpinned? How often is there an undercurrent of neglect or issues or the same kind of issues that are associated with neglect are underlying all of these kind of things? And what others? What are the other sort of current issues do you think that are deflecting or sucking some of the attention?
Infant mental health.
Yes, infant mental health. Digital, online, yeah, I've got that enough. But also children spent with screen time. those kind of issues as well. Obesity, that's another one that's really taking a lot of concern.
I think it's a lot of stress for children around the current climate change.
Yes, so that's become the thing we're worried about. Are we stressing our kids out in relation to the climate? Yes. Yeah. So we have hot topics, don't we, that just get attention. And they're not unimportant, but it means that initiatives that start kind of fizzle out because we have something else that gets our attention. So this is making me wonder, is there an extent to which our systems mirror the issue that we're dealing with? So back in 1998, I mean, I'm feeling, this is all feeling a little bit narcissistic, sorry, I'm quoting myself an awful lot. But anyway, never mind, it's too late now, it's on the slide. I wrote a paper called Picture of Powerlessness, and again it was looking at neglect and ways in which social workers and parents can be empowered. My premise was that practitioners get drawn into the kind of learned helplessness of the families they're working with, because there's a sense of that the situation for the families and the children feels so hopeless, and practitioners are trying so hard to do something to so little effect that they get drawn into that sense of it's all just helpless and hopeless. And so the little quote from that was, we have a picture of children with low self-esteem and self-efficacy, mothers with low esteem who believe no one could help them, fathers who are absent or uninvolved, frequently unemployed, coupled with social workers and other professionals who feel they're anxiously propping up an unsatisfactory situation within a child protection system that does not provide a theoretical or practical framework for intervention in a context of material deprivation for families and resource constraints for helping agencies. A picture of powerlessness indeed. Right, so that was quite a long time ago I wrote that, but I'm not sure if that isn't probably holding true for many people still today. So, I mean, the premise, it's perhaps quite a psychoanalytical concept really, is that you all get drawn into the system and everyone becomes part of the same sort of anxious, helpless feeling system. But then I was wondering whether this isn't happening again in relation to our inability to stick with initiatives that we have started. One of the most solid pieces of evidence that we have about we have about effective practice with neglect is it has to be long-term and stick with the family. Important pieces of evidence that comes out from the research is that there aren't really any quick fixes in working with neglect. Is that it needs to be long-term, solid graft of being alongside the family and just sticking with them. And I'm beginning to wonder whether we aren't falling prey to the kind of start again syndrome, but in a more system structural way. So here's a quote about the start again syndrome, which was applied to individual working with individual families. Marion Brandon and others' work. It's been a very, very important concept that has really resonated with people. One of the common ways of dealing with overwhelming information, feelings of helplessness generated in workers by the families, was to put aside knowledge of the past, focus on the present, and what we've called the start again syndrome. In this respect, a new pregnancy or a new baby would seem to present a fresh start. And we know, now I think people are very aware of this. This has been a very influential piece of research and piece of work and has been a helpful kind of concept. But I'm wondering whether we couldn't extend that concept and think about it in a more broader sense about how it might be something that's going on a little bit in our attraction to shiny, bright things. Are we all becoming prey to the start again syndrome in terms of frequent policy change? To an extent, that is obviously axiomatic to our political system. You know, we have regular changes of governments, but it's not impossible actually to set up cross-party committees and agreements to continue with particular policies. And to some extent, that has been quite successful in Scotland, in that there has been agreement to kind of stick with some policies over time. But I'm not saying we're not prey to the start again syndrome, because we are, and you can't move but fall tripping over ACEs in Scotland at the moment. For a while it was asset-based and then it became ACEs. We have a lot of national and local initiatives that fizzle out. Short-term funding for projects has been well, ever since I started working in social work, this was an issue that you heard from all the projects that were set up in all the communities to support families. They all constantly complained about the need to continually reapply for funding to keep going. And the number of new initiatives that started, and they would have to then change their objectives a little bit in order to meet the requirements of the new funding stream that was coming out, in order to get funding to continue with a project they knew that was working well. Again, very much a start again syndrome that goes on with project. You see this, the wasted resource in getting a new project up and running, getting all the staff trained up, getting everything in place, taking the time to build the relationships with families, and then the funding is pulled. We see this happening so often. But there is something still that's very attractive about shiny new interventions, and we can't help ourselves. So, trends and fashions, I'm not saying these things don't have value, but isn't it interesting how we have all these buzz things that appear and then disappear again? When I was in social work, solution-focused approaches were really the big thing, and everyone was sent on training for that, and then we were solution-focusing everybody that moved. Family group conferences, yeah, that was the big new thing. And to some extent, it has been embedded in some aspects of our system. I'm not saying these things haven't had some influence, but we don't stick with them, that's the trouble. Asset-based, that was a big one in health. Certainly in health in Scotland, asset-based became a really big thing. Brief therapy, that was another one. That was a lovely one. You think, right, you can fix it all really quickly and move on to the next one. Reclaiming social work. Still some projects around that going, but you're not hearing quite so much about it anymore. Resilience, sorry, hands up, that was my one. Well, not exclusively me, but I did quite a lot of research, and I was asked all over the place to talk about resilience. But that's kind of fizzling out a bit because it's been overtaken a little bit by the ACE's work. Implementation science. That was a wonderful one, wasn't it? Neuroscience. There's been a huge critique now of the extent to which the neuroscience was naively and simplistically applied, particularly in cases of neglect. And the picture of the fat and healthy brain against the skinny little squidgy brain, which we saw all over the place. And was used to sort of beat parents over the head with, you know, if you don't read a story to your child every night, this is what your child's brain will look like. So, again, it was a really shiny one, that one, neuroscience, but it's kind of faded a little bit more. ACEs, yes, as you know, what I'm thinking about that. I mean, lots to be said about it, but it's become the one shiny, bright new thing. Trauma-informed, we're hearing it everywhere now. Any more? Yeah.
The common assessment.
Oh yes, yeah. Oh yes, the common assessment. Yes.
We've got single assessment, and it was in 2 parts, but now it's single assessment in 1 part. So.
Yes, absolutely. Well, again, I'm not saying there isn't virtue to all these things. In fact, like the opposite. I'm saying there is, but we can't stick with things very well. Any others? Anything else? Any more buzzwords? Yeah.
We had Chloes that were linked with the schools, Chloes and Chloes that were like independent people that went between the schools.
Oh, there's people Chloes.
People Chloes, yeah. People. The Chloes were there for the children, so as an advocate, and the Flows were there for the family. So there was that link between neglect and that they would literally do practical things and work alongside. But we lost the funding.
We lost the funding,
and it worked really well because you really got to see what life was like for those children, and you got to hear it from the children daily on the walk to school. And it was a very successful project in an area where there was deprivation around very affluent, and they just went, and I still think, fantastic.
We've all got something that we think, oh, that worked so well, why did we let it go? Yeah. Chloe's. Good one. Any others?
FMP, I think, falls into this as well, with funding being pulled in a lot, you know, commissioning, withdrawn and things.
Yeah. So there's been so many of these things, and what's hard is that quite a lot of resource usually goes into these things, and there's usually very front-loaded resource, and then kind of fizzles out, so people can't then follow things through in the way they would like to be able to make it work. And again, in relation to neglect, there's all these kind of supposed pathways to a solution in terms of these different kinds of approaches. But sometimes, in particular with neglect, a lack of clarity about the destination and a lack of focus, and much more of an emphasis on the method rather than what it is that's going to suit that particular child and family. A lack of consistency and endurance, which is completely contrary to the characteristics of a social problem that should be, and an individual problem that's not amenable to quick fixes. The thing is, we know about neglect. Whenever you look at the research on particular kind of methods, very sort of methods where you have to stick to the fidelity of them, usually there's a rider that says, well, this doesn't always work that well with neglect. Because so many situations where there's neglect is so complex with so many different things going on that you can't then schedule, the 1 hour weekly particular whatever it is, CBC or something with the parent, because there's so much going on. So nearly always there's a little rider in the research that says it's a great thing, but it doesn't really work for that. What we're finding, I think, is that the improvement attempts in relation to neglect particularly are fragmented across training, development, research initiatives, none of which is kind of sufficient in scope and scale to tackle a phenomenon that is complex, entrenched, and none of which really are sustained long enough. Because you need in terms of working individually with neglect, you need the kind of support that actually pretty much goes right through the childhood of that child. In terms of embedding new kind of approaches that's going upstream or focusing on need, you need systemic change that's really wholesale systemic change. And it's really difficult to do because, again, as I say, you get policy change, you get initiative change, and things fizzle out. There was one of the examples, I think, of this where there was an attempt in Scotland to really change the system with getting it right for every child model with the named person, which was to really try and move upstream and to enable each child to have someone that they could turn to who was a first point of contact for them. And it was primarily through health visiting or through education. And as many of you will know, that was challenged in court, and it went to the Supreme Court, and it was considered to be breaching kind of information sharing arrangements and kind of confidentiality for parents. And it was something that started out as an attempt to truly embrace the notion that you don't focus on risk, you focus on need, that we should focus on help seeking, not imposing on help on people when it's too late, that it was focusing on the universal services who are far less threatening in terms of being part of a child protection system. But what it showed is that as a nation, actually, and as a culture, we are not ready to accept the notion that it's okay to ask for help. Basically, we still stigmatize the notion that you might need to seek a bit of help with parenting. And that the notion that someone might be looking out for you and being able to offer you a bit of help is actually seen as being sucked into a nanny state or a child protection system. So we're still not ready for that. So we're talking about a need to do really big, significant cultural change to move to a system where it feels okay for people to be able to say, I need a bit of help with my parenting. And we don't seem to have got to that place yet. However, we could stitch together all the evidence we have in relation to neglect. And we could use what is a really helpful framework, the ecological transactional developmental framework that, again, Marion Brandon and others developed, building on Bronfenbrenner's work, which is really a kind of it's actually a 4-dimensional model. Because what it does is it encourages you to think about the impact of the past upon the present and on the future trajectory of the family and the child. It asks you to look at the child and family in the context, the ecological context within which they're in. So it's looking at back and forward, but also out and in. in terms of the child, the family, the community, and the wider structure. And it also asks you to consider the aspects within the family and within the nature of the relationships between the family and the helping organisations, and in the nature of the organisational context within which people are working. So it asks you to look at the relational aspects, the time aspects, and the ecological aspects. So it's a bit like kind of 3D chess or something, if any of you remember your Star Trek. But it's a really elegant, really nice framework, and it's very helpful, particularly for neglect. And the reason there isn't any simple things for neglect is because there isn't any simple response to neglect, because it is complicated. And that's why you need this kind of model. And what it enables you to do is looking at different layers of factors in relation to the child, the family, the wider community, and the social structures, to look at the impact of the past on the present, the development and behaviour of individuals in the context of the environments in which they live. That development is dynamic, it's shaped by the interactions between the environment, the caregiver, and the child, and the range of structural factors that affect development. So basically it's hard. That's hard graft. No wonder we look for a shiny, bright, brief intervention if your choice is doing all of that, or, oh, here I can do a quick solution-focused response. But this is hard graft, and this needs all the different disciplines to pull together. It needs everyone to work together and to really have some stickability with this, and to look at each of these different layers. And I think we could stitch some of this together, and we've got plenty of evidence that we could use to populate a bit of a logic model around this now, of course. Logic models are also a fad. They're kind of almost had their day now, but I thought I'd just hang on to them quickly before they go, because it's actually quite a useful way just to sort of capture some of the information we have in relation to neglect. I'm not going to give you everything that you need in terms of sorting neglect, but what I'm suggesting is that we could bring together everything we need to tackle neglect in a comprehensive way. So we need to look at the social context, for example. We need to look at the policy and legislative framework. We need to look at integrated services for children and families, and we need to look at the individual child and family experiences. And we need to look at what inputs, activities, outputs we need, and what are our shorter and longer term goals in relation to this. So I'm just going to pull out just a few examples of just things that we might think about. So in relation to the social context, in terms of inputs, what we need is for well-being of children to be seen as a national priority. Now, I think we're quite a long way even from that. So, and sad as it may seem, I just still feel we have a real sense that some children are more important than others. And that we have the inequalities that we're quite content with to live with, as was identified in the quote from earlier on, just runs through a lot of the thinking in terms of policy. And the emphasis on well-being of all children, we've still got a way to go on that. We need to then be able to analyse the impact of poor child well-being on society. So actually, what seems difficult for the nation to grasp is that actually it's going to be better for everybody if we promote the well-being of all children. It's a better society for everyone to live in. It's not just about it being better for children. And it's not just about rearing a bunch of sort of inward-looking, narcissistic individual children. It's about having a better society for everyone if all children have reasonable well-being. So we need the data to inform some of that change of culture about what a difference it would make for all of us if we tackle the inequalities and structural factors that are affecting well-being of children. If we tackle them, it'll make it better for everybody else as well. And an increased recognition of the benefits to all of child well-being. And then we would be in a position where the conditions that promote the neglect of children are no longer socially acceptable. I mean, it should really be a national scandal, and indeed one of the Action for Children studies did describe this as a scandal that wasn't really being tackled, because particularly in the UK we have always been, forever, I mean like forever, if you go way back as far as living history, we have been very, very content with massive inequalities. We just are. It's culturally in our DNA that we are content. We're not rising up on the streets about inequalities. One example of an attempt to address the social context has been an interesting new kind of critique that's emerging of the GDP as a measure of wealth of a nation. And there are a number of governments which are establishing what they're calling a well-being economy governments, WEGO governments. So Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand are having a go at this. And Nicola Sturgeon did a really interesting TED talk recently on this. And here's just a little quote from this, which I think, we're talking about, you know, a really kind of ambitious consideration of a different way of measuring the well-being of a country. What we choose to measure as a country matters. It really matters because it drives political focus, it drives public activity. And against that context, I think the limitations of GDP as a measurement of a country's success are all too obvious. GDP measures the output of all our work, but it says nothing about the nature of that work, about whether that work is worthwhile or fulfilling. It puts a value, for example, on illegal drug consumption, but not on unpaid care. It values activity in the short term that boosts the economy, even if that activity is hugely damaging to the sustainability of our planet in the longer term. Growth in GDP should not be pursued at any or all cost. In fact, the argument of that group is that the goal, the objective of economic policy should be collective well-being. How happy and healthy a population is, not just how wealthy a population is. Indicators as varied as income inequality, the happiness of children, access to green spaces, access to housing. None of these are captured in GDP statistics, but they are all fundamental to a healthy and a happy society. I think that's a very powerful argument. I think in my new role now, one of the divisions in my school is a business school. That's been a new world for me, working with business academics. But it's really interesting how there is a huge critique now of GDP and our traditional measures of wealth and economic well-being. And the challenge to GDP is growing, and it kind of goes alongside some of the climate protests and some of the notions of the concerns about the impact of globalization. So this is, I think this is a very ambitious approach, but certainly in New Zealand, they're going great guns for this. Some of you may have heard the Prime Minister of New Zealand talking about this. Nicola Sturgeon is certainly keen to have a go at it in Scotland. And Iceland are really having a good go at it. So I think there could be something here which is really thinking about, you can't just look at these things in isolation. We can't just change the way we work with neglect. We need to have a society that really puts the well-being of children as part of something that's going to be helpful for all of us. So that's just one example of what you might do at a national level to affect society. Looking at policy and legislation, you can look at the policy and legislative framework. We need to recognise neglect as a public health issue. How often have we been saying that? We've been saying that for a while. Julie's been saying that for many years, Julie Taylor. And we need to analyse the policy through a public health lens and revise our policy and associated legislation. And yes, say it again, devote resources to upstream initiatives. And then we can reduce the neglectogenic conditions. I made that word up, it's a nice one. I think I made it up, probably I didn't. I bet Olive Stevens has said it, or somebody said it before. But yes, so the thing is not just starting with a neglected child and trying to fix that. Let's look at all these factors that lead to that child getting to be neglected in the first place and take a public health approach. And Julie and Jane in particular, Jane Scott, did some really interesting thinking about what would a public health approach be. And they felt really important to challenge or to sort of cover what it isn't, because people often have misconceptions about what a public health approach is. So it's not just about epidemics, it's not about going soft on abuse and neglect, it's not about making children responsible for behavioural change, because some public health approaches are about behaviour change. So some of those public health approaches to drugs, for example, are the just say no ones. That's about individuals just changing what they do. as opposed to stopping drugs coming into the country in the first place, for example, which would be my sense of a public health approach, rather than telling someone just not to take them. So public health doesn't always mean upstream and structural. It sometimes means just telling someone not to do something. It's not just for health practitioners, it's not just about primary prevention. It doesn't mean we can't act until we have complete understanding, and it's not a prescribed set of methods. But it's an overall framework to understand the delivery landscape. Promoting well-being, curbing ill effects. And there's another one, salutogenesis. Julie, that was one, wasn't it? It was a really popular one, salutogenesis. Julie's whole PhD was about it. Promoting health rather than focusing on ill health. Curbing the effects of social behaviours as much as it is about responding to outbreaks. So a public health approach, again, we should argue that this is really what we need in relation to neglect. And in a move towards trying to tackle this, we managed to get some funding to set up a PhD in Stirling. I've now moved on from supervising this PhD, but we got it going in the first place, which is framing neglect as a public health issue. And the PhD student is using a Delphi approach to try and get a sense from experts in the field as to what a public health approach to neglect could look like. Because, again, with neglect, it's complex. You could take it from all sorts of different angles. You could go in at all sorts of different levels. But where do people feel would be the most useful kind of upstream approach we could take for neglect? And so she's going great guns with that study, and I hope that'll give us some very useful insights. And then we can go down to another level where we can say, okay, we need to look at the integrated services landscape. There's no doubt that for neglect, because neglect affects every domain of a child's life, that you need all the different professions and disciplines to be involved. You need integrated services. But we need to finesse that interface, because we're still struggling with the interface between the universal and the targeted services. We're still stuck in that of, is this a referral or is it not? Is this one of yours, is this one of ours? Is this an in need or is this a risk? We're still struggling around with some of that. Except that there are really good examples where people have set up projects where they have dealt with that interface, but then we don't learn from those effective, good projects, and we don't stick with it. We need to look for examples of where this is working well, because I'm sure you've all seen examples of really good multidisciplinary initiatives where everyone has pulled together and really pooled their resources and focused on what do we need to do to help this child and this family or to help this community. And so we need to learn from where those are working well, and we need to really, really stick with that and make sure that that becomes the sort of shining examples of what you can do, so that we can really revise our approaches to service delivery, and so that families and children can experience less fragmented provision, and we can have more seamless services for parents and for children. So as I say, we just need to look at all these interfaces. I should have had police on there, sorry, Simon. I should have had police on there. And then looking just very briefly, I'm nearly finished, looking at individual child and family experiences. Because it's too simple to say, well, let's just shift our resources from there and shove them upstream, because we have too many children and families who are desperately affected by all these structural factors and need help and need it really now. And what we need for them is authoritative practice, and this is what I've argued in a number of places, that we need practice that combines empathy for the factors that are affecting parents and understanding of what's affecting them with a sharp focus on the needs of the child. So I would describe that as authoritative practice. So we don't need to abandon our child protection lens. We don't need to abandon our focus on the huge damage that neglect causes to children and how that is a real child protection issue. And if by focusing on needs, it doesn't mean that we abandon our focus on risks. We can bring them together in authoritative practice. So we're not being soft on neglect, but we're incorporating empathy and support for parents. And we have comprehensive assessment using this ecological transactional developmental framework with comprehensive plans. So you know all this. This is what you know we need for children who are neglected. And we know Jane Scott and I undertook a review of the literature for the Scottish Government, a rapid review of the literature on intervention. And again, looking at all the different kind of research on intervention, again, many of the papers were focusing on one particular model and saying, well, it works sometimes for some people and sometimes for others it doesn't. So again, it was really important just to clarify the issue for that particular family and that particular child, and to have an individualised child-centred response. You cannot just tack a method onto a family. You need to understand what's needed. How often do we say it's important to engage the family, to create a safe environment, to look at parental sensitivity? These are all features that come through the literature that we have known, and we know about defining clear objectives, monitoring regular, setting clear achievable goals, modifying the intervention based on the family's needs. All of this is not rocket science. We know it. It's about sticking with it. But another really important one is about the relationships. And Liz Reimer in Australia did some really interesting research around relationships in working with families where there is neglect. And again, looking at the importance of empathy. And it's very helpful, her work is very helpful in understanding, helping people to understand the anger and rejection and the fractious relationships that can develop between parents and practitioners. And she really premises the importance of developing that relationship. And going back to the lists of all these different kinds of models of interventions, all these different kind of interventions and types of approach. Again, many of you will remember some of that research that suggested that one of the biggest things that makes a difference as to whether a particular model works or not is the quality of the practitioner and the quality of the relationship. I'm not saying it doesn't matter what intervention you're using, but as important to that intervention working is the quality of the relationship. And that makes up a good chunk of whether that is going to be effective or not, the connection. So that we can create authoritative practice where you have empathic relationship-based support, focused attention on protection of harm for the child, and creative and flexible approaches to intervention. So, I have reclaimed my inner Pollyanna.